So, welcome back, everybody. I hope you can hear me properly. Before continuing with the program, I put up here a slide related to the so-called PRISMAP user forum, which is open for everybody to join. So please feel invited to go there. It's found on the website. You see here a link below on the PRISMAP website. You find the information on the user forum, which allows in-depth interaction with you who are users of these novel radionuclides PRISMAP is dealing with. So having novel radionuclides for medical application is one thing. Translating them into a clinical application is another thing, and that is, but at the end, one aim to make this possible also within PRISMAP. In the PRISMAP structure, which Thierry Stora has shown initially. You have seen that there are different activities ongoing, and I'm actually leading a work package within PRISMAP that is called Harmonization and Standardization, which focuses on the issues related to the fact that radiopharmaceuticals that we make of also PRISMAP radionuclides medicinal products or drugs. So you find yourself in this translation process within pharmaceutical regulations, and we actually will have sorry, I got a technical note. I'm in presentation mode. You can see this one. Yeah, but now it's okay. That's okay. Okay. Sorry for this interruption. I thought you may not be able to see my slides properly, but we are in the field of pharmaceutical regulation, and that is now the topic of my presentation. As I mentioned, we have also an internal workshop of PRISMAP the following days, where we will also discuss the needs to cope with and to standardize our development towards these issues. And partly this talk I will present is also giving you some for those who will participate in the workshop, also some introduction to this topic, and for people outside, hopefully also useful insights into the regulations related to pharmaceuticals. So let's move ahead to something different to the presenters before. The EU Pharmaceutical Regulations, and of course, PRISMAP is a project funded by the European Union. So I will, of course, focus on the European situation, in particular the situation of the European Union. So radiopharmaceuticals are, as I mentioned already, since the 1980s in Europe, defined as drugs, or what is the legal terminology of that in the regulatory framework, medicinal products. But of course, their speciality is that they are radioactive. So you have a regulatory framework related to the radioactive nature of it. But you have, of course, taking into account legislations related to drugs or medicines that are then influencing what a radiopharmacist and nuclear medicine can do with these compounds. The there are a number of matters, and I will, in my talk now, of course, focus on the pharmaceutical side of regulations, and only in, I think, one example mention that there is, of course, radiation safety regulations also to be considered. But what does this concern in terms of radiopharmaceuticals and radionuclides? We, of course, have regulations related to the use of the radiopharmaceutical, and in the pharmaceutical sense, of course, regulated in a more general way, which partly deals with marketing authorization that I will cover. We have regulations related on how we have to prepare our radiopharmaceuticals, very much related to the famous three letters, the good manufacturing practices, GMP. We have then also to consider the quality of our radiopharmaceuticals and also the equipment here. I will mention the Pharmacopoeia that comes into play, and we have ways of bringing new radiopharmaceuticals into clinical use finally in the context of clinical trials, and I will show you also some issues related to that. I will not go in any details in the radiation safety regulations, as I mentioned, or in also including waste management, or also not mention issues related to transportation. Actually, a dedicated work package also in PRISMAP, led by Michael Jensen, that you could get to know in the previous talk. So first of all, to introduce you in this regulatory environment, some slides. What are the pharmaceutical players in the regulatory field, and that, of course, then also affects the radiopharmaceutical context. So where are we? We are, of course, in the European Union. You know that, and the European Union has some legal entities, structures, in particular the European Parliament that votes on legislation. We have a kind of government, that's the European Commission, which has what on the national level are ministries, so-called directorates general, DGs. And here we have the DG Energy, which, when it comes to radiation and radiation safety, deals with that. But we have currently the DG Health that deals with pharmaceuticals, which was not always the case. For some time, a lot of pharmaceutical issues were within the DG Industry. That had changed some years ago. And then we have names, and that's always, particular for a non-native speaker, very confusing terms like the European Council, the Council of the European Union. I will not go into detail, but we will come across the Council of Europe as one different player that has to be differentiated. So the particular issue, and that's for those, and I believe we may have a few people outside the European Union, has, in terms of legislation, a particular system that is to accommodate the different nations that the European Union is composed of. So the main two tools where laws, rules, and regulations are included are so-called directives and regulations. So directives are, well, let's get first to the regulations, which is very clear. That's the same as and on the national level, that's a legal text that is enforceable, and you have to follow this text as it is written down. But additionally, the European Union has directives that are also in their wording a bit broader, and these that individual nations then have to implement the legal text considerations that are included in that into their national law. And this leads, even though we have the European Union, to quite some differences, in particular also in the field of radiopharmaceuticals and radionuclides. This is quite obvious if you compare the practices that you have to that are being followed in different countries. So here you see a few legal texts. Most texts that we have to deal with are directives, so also the radiation safety standards, so-called Euratom directives. But we have, and will be important in my talk, the Directive 2001/83. You see that is the Pharmaceutical Directive. But recently we have seen more also regulations, so which are leave less room for interpretation, particularly the clinical trial regulation that has just been enforced in end of January. We can find all the legal text of the European Union in a compendium that is called the EudraLex. So you just need to Google that, and you will find all the text in all the at least the main texts in all languages of the European Union, so you can find and can have a look and read it if you have nothing better to do, and look into this EudraLex system. And one important document, as I mentioned, here is the Central Directive for Pharmaceuticals, or the official term then Medicinal Products, that is also called the Pharmaceutical Directive 2001/83/EC. That you see here the official headline of this text out of the EudraLex, which was it's the basis. It's pretty old. It's from 2001 and has been amended by many different additional texts, and both directives and regulations. But this is still the main basis for it, and there's currently a strategy to actually revise it because of things getting a little bit old. So in the European Union, that's maybe especially was important also for us as in the radiopharmaceutical field, that the drafting of such documents is quite transparent. So you can you see concept papers published. You can comment on that. That's what we did in particular, for example, within the ENM, the European Nuclear Medicine Association. So we have the European Union as one player, and what, of course, most of you know is that there is also a European Medicines Agency, often seen as the counterpart to the American FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. The special thing about it, what one should know, that the European Medicines Agency has no legal power as such. So it's actually an agency of the European Union. So when I come then to marketing authorization, for example, that is officially not issued by the EMA, but by the in Brussels by the European Union parts. So here you can also, it's everything very transparent. So you can go to the EMA site and they will tell you what their role is in the surveillance of medicines, and particular to ensure an appropriate evaluation of new drugs that should come on the market, and all what is related to that. So the EMA is situated now, has moved due to the Brexit, from London to Amsterdam, and is composed of different scientific committees and working parties Important also for us is that there is a so-called safety working party and the quality working party. Sorry for the arrow here. One tends to think that there are hundreds or thousands of experts sitting at the EMA, sitting in these committees, but actually the structure is typically European. So it's actually the national governments and national agencies that I'll mention later on that feed these groups that make evaluations of medicines, but also make guidelines on how we should do that. So EMA is providing guidelines. They strictly spoken have no legal power as such, but of course are very strong documents because they are issued by the authorities that have to approve what you want to do in the terms, in the context of pharmaceuticals. Here are some guidelines mentioned. The EMA provided. There is a special code to it where you can see where this was originating from. One important guideline which relates to issues on marketing authorization of radiopharmaceuticals. It has a code QWP, so that means Quality Working Party, or CHMP, the committee I mentioned before. And some guidelines also include the ICH, and three-letter code ICH, say published in the EMA context, but the ICH is actually with some important guidelines. You will see one or two examples later on. It's actually a harmonization body, mainly originally at least, mainly between the US, Japan, and Europe, and looks at topics that are of common interest to be standardized. I word it like this. For example, in relation to analytical validation, I will show that, and also what is known among many of you is the so-called microdosing scheme that was then also ending up in an ICH guideline. Again, EMA is making such recommendations, guidelines in a relatively transparent way, where they first state that they want to draft something in that direction, and you can again give your input in that, and this will be at least read. How much of it will be implemented is probably varying on the topic and on the importance for also the pharmaceutical industry in general. So that's another player. But of course, in particular in Europe, we have national players. We have in particular you could say drug agencies, or in other legal text also called so-called competent authorities. You see some examples here of the Austrian is the AGES, in France the NSM, and in Germany the so-called BfArM, or in Italy the IFA. Swissmedic, of course, no, and MHRA, not anymore part of as the MHRA of the UK organization, not been part of the European Union anymore. So they have in some ways a similar role to the EMA on a European level, on a national level, but there is a lot of interaction, and a lot of expertise is not sitting at the EMA, but is sitting in the national agencies. So do we have other players? Yes, we have. I will keep that brief, but we have, I mentioned that before, the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe actually has nothing to do with the European Union. It's an organization that was founded beforehand and with the aim to protect human rights. So what does this have to do with the pharmaceutical context or radiopharmaceuticals? It's that one of their mission, based on the human right to have a good quality of medicines, is the publication of the European Pharmacopoeia. And this is done in the organization that's called EDQM, the European Directorate of Quality of Medicines. That is a body of the Council of Europe that is actually situated in Strasbourg, and actually owns the rights for the flag that the European Union is using. It's just borrowed from the Council of Europe. So the Pharmacopoeia is a book containing standards, but what has to do with regulations? It is a legal text because the countries that have signed, most countries that are members of the Council of Europe have signed a document that is called the Pharmacopoeia Convention, and in that convention they stated that the Pharmacopoeia is the legal basis for the quality of medicines they use, and that is true for the European countries. Additionally, this standard is also recognized by what are called observer states, and you see here this large number of countries that are also taking into account the European Pharmacopoeia. For example, those who are members of the Commonwealth. And we find a number of chapters. I will come back to that briefly later on, but stating what is the legal status. Also interesting to know that even though it's a legal document that one considers to be legally binding, and a number of texts are legally binding, like the so-called the monographs of the European Pharmacopoeia. There are also other texts like general chapters that are not legally binding, or only in a certain context when they are cited in in a legally binding text. So not everything that is written down necessarily is a legal text to be stated here. So what do we find in regulations as definition? Of course, we find that in the Pharmaceutical Directive, the 2001/83, and it describes in what a medicinal product is. At the beginning, of course, normally you think of substances that are treating diseases. But additionally to that, and that comes, is of course that also substances that are used for a medical diagnosis. So that's where a number of radiopharmaceutical come into play. And the directive also, since many years, and in the 1980s, introduced radiopharmaceutical in this regulatory framework, already defining what a radiopharmaceutical is. I think that's clear for everyone, but also mentions what a radionuclide generator kit or a so-called radionuclide precursor is, and puts the generators kits and radionuclide precursors in the same context and level of regulations as a radiopharmaceutical and most normal pharmaceuticals as well. So this put these compounds in this legal framework with a number of implications, for example, for the authorization, but also for following the production standards and so on. Is a radioactive product always a medicinal product? There is also a differentiation if it's a sealed source, and like the Sirtex yttrium labeled small particles, they are sealed sources, not considered as medicinal product, but as a medical device, and so they fall under a different part of the regulation that I will not go into any details. So, also, I mean, if we then, that's typically the therapeutic application, but any other products that are not considered as sealed sources are then medicinal products. And if you develop a new radiopharmaceutical, then it is defined in that context as an investigational medicinal product, or IMP. That's the abbreviation of it. So coming now to the normal way of how pharmaceuticals are generally used, which is the marketing authorization process briefly. So in principle, we have different ways of regulatory ways of using pharmaceuticals and also radiopharmaceuticals, then, which is the marketing authorization track. That's the normal way. We can do clinical trials. I will briefly also mention that. And we have a special way, which is very much nationally regulated, often considered as extemporaneous preparation, very much involving pharmacy practices. I will leave out this part at this presentation due to time constraints, but that it's also, especially in the context of radiopharmaceutical, important to mention that in many cases this third pathway is being used. But then, let's say the normal way of also pharmaceuticals are used is that the product has a authorization, a so-called marketing authorization, and that is defined again in the Pharmaceutical Directive. That that this is issued by the competent authorities of member states, and so on, and refers not also to radionuclide generators, kits, radionuclide precursors, and industrially prepared radiopharmaceuticals. So we have in principle three ways of getting such a marketing authorization. That, let's say, historically way also in particular for what radiopharmaceuticals are concerned is that they got an authorization in each country individually. So they issued a national authorization, and then there is a special process within Europe that is called the mutual recognition procedure. So a national authority can accept at a certain time point the application, the marketing authorization of another member state without going into the whole process again. Then on the European level, it was decided that especially for very new products and for certain very important indications like oncology or Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative diseases, the member states should not play their own games, so to speak, and make their own. That should be done on a European level, and introduced many years ago the so-called centralized procedure, where this evaluation process is done by the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, and that's now actually mandatory for many products without going into detail here. And then there is a intermediate procedure, the so-called decentralized procedure, where someone who wants to get a marketing authorization can say, I want to have the marketing authorization already in 5 different European countries. Then one country is referred to as a reference. Member states, they do the evaluation, and all the others then more or less accept what at one time point what the others said. So that's the 3 pathways. And as I said, when you come back to radiopharmaceuticals, most, let's say, old radiopharmaceuticals are licensed or have a marketing authorization based on this national procedure. We have a very few that underwent this decentralized procedure. One of the germanium gallium generators went this way. And we have in particular newer and products, in particular therapeutic products that were underwent the centralized procedure, like the Xofigo, the Lutathera, but also radionuclide precursors such as the lutetium chloride from different vendors, but also diagnostic, like the amyloid tracers, underwent the centralized procedure. This process, I mean, cannot go into any detail, but there are many guidelines on how to to apply for marketing authorization. And this is a very structured format and gives you with clear indications where you have to provide your information, and divides this information into quality information and other information, non-clinical and clinical information that then more relates to safety and efficacy of compounds, including like pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and these things. And here 2 examples of, as I mentioned, 2 actually centralized licensed products in the last year: lutetium chloride as the precursor from one company, or the lutetium dotatate from another company, receiving marketing authorization in this way. So when you apply for that, and already in early steps, there are, of course, many rules related to how these pharmaceuticals, in particular radiopharmaceuticals, have to be prepared. And here we come to the standardized practices, the so-called good manufacturing practices, that are also legally defined in relation to the Directive 2001/83, which says that medicinal products that are on the market have to be prepared according to these practices. That's the wording, typical wording of a directive. And this is true for finished pharmaceuticals, and then also radiopharmaceuticals. Sorry for that. But not only for that, but also for the active substances. So the or sometimes called active substances that are being used within this medicinal product. Okay, I will get the GMP rules. You can also find in the Udralex in the volume 4 here, just the general chapters of GMP, which not only looks into what is often considered premises and how things are being produced, but many other aspects of it. So many implications, like that we have to use clean rooms for preparation of radiopharmaceuticals, and hot cells that match pharmaceutical standards. So that's related to the setup of the premises, but much more, as I mentioned, like personal resources, a lot related to documentation and so on. Beside these general chapters, we have annexes that are also in part of the GMP, and here we have, among other important annexes, like Annex 1 for sterile products, we have the dedicated annex for radioactive products, for radiopharmaceuticals, and this is just an extract of the table which, for example, defines. This is an important table also for the PRISMAP, where GMP should start in the production of radiopharmaceuticals or radionuclide generators. We have, these good practices are also needed not only when you have a marketing authorization, but also when you do clinical trials with pharmaceuticals. So that is what is stated there in the new regulation. As I mentioned, that is now mandatory since January 31st this year, even though it was made already in 2014, took a long time. And also says that you have to follow good manufacturing practices. Interestingly, they introduced a dedicated exemption for radiopharmaceuticals if on a national level there are specific rules deviating from this for diagnostic investigation medicine products, so diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals, there may be this paragraph does not apply, so there may be special rules related to that. We also not only have to look in the production side, but also in the quality of pharmaceuticals in general and of radiopharmaceuticals in particular. And very often when we discuss that, we limit that to the final product that we use in patients, but that is not true. The quality of the finished product also relates to what we are using to produce that. We should not forget that, and that is very much also in this pharmaceutical thinking and in this regulatory environment an important point, that also the things you start with, in case of radiopharmaceuticals, the radionuclide, the non-radioactive component that you are labeling, and then potentially in also the things that you need additionally, so-called excipients, need to be considered in these quality considerations. And as mentioned, when it comes to quality, we move from the European Union to the Council of Europe, which publishes the European Pharmacopoeia via the EDQM. And the Pharmacopoeia is structured in a certain way. So we have, let's say, more general texts that describe methods or a particular group of pharmaceuticals. So and these texts can be monographs. So there is, for example, a general monograph on radiopharmaceutical preparations, but there may be also chapters on specific methods like residual solvents or sterility. But then you have also monographs for dedicated products. These products can be, in the case of radiopharmaceuticals, it's actually the finished products. So a preparation, as stated also in the general monograph, which makes radiopharmaceuticals a little bit particular, whereas for most other pharmaceuticals, the main texts that you find there are those for the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or for the drug substance that is used, not for the final formulation, the tablet or whatever it may be. Okay, in relation to, now we've come to PRISMAP, we also find quality criteria for starting materials. In particular, you have monographs on radionuclide precursors. Examples for sodium iodide, iodine-131 for radio labeling, or the lutetium-177 solution for radio labeling. So actually the product that I mentioned before that was licensed has also to follow the quality that is described in the European Pharmacopoeia, as there is a monograph on this compound. And for not such a long period of time, we also have monographs on the non-radioactive starting materials, the so-called chemical precursors, where we have a general monograph on that, and monographs for certain products that are widely used. I just took the example of DTPA, which is used, and the monograph here describes the use for then technetium labeling in this case. In relation to quality, we have the Pharmacopoeia with dedicated text, and if you look for specifications, we have to go to the Pharmacopoeia. But if it comes partly then also to the methods when we use them, what we have to do. We also have to look into other texts, and we come back here to the European Medicines Agency that was formerly named the EMEA in older times, and which, as I mentioned, also has these ICH documents, and here we find an ICH Q2R1 guideline that defines how we have to validate our analytical procedures. That's an important guideline. Again, here we leave actually the strictly legally binding text, but it's a very strong, indirectly relevant text that we have to look into. And as one example of that indicate for the radiopharmaceuticals, that this is then again interpreted in a more specific way than often not by the EMA, for example, but by professional organizations. And here there is a dedicated ENM guideline, again, that is not legally binding, but gives good guidance on how to validate analytical methods when it comes to radiopharmaceuticals, where we have, again, very specific considerations. So, and finally, I come to the regulations and considerations when we develop pharmaceuticals in general and radiopharmaceuticals in particular, coming to the clinical trial regulations. So the very typical pathway that also one, you learn when you enter certain studies, it's always these phases from phase 1 to phase 3, where you then, after completing a phase 3 trial, then apply for the marketing authorization, and then a phase 4, which is then ongoing to monitor the newer drugs in a wider population when they already have received the marketing authorization. That would then be the phase 4 trials. In the context of PRISMAP and many of us who work with radiopharmaceuticals, we are typically in earlier phases of clinical trials, so often phase 1, phase 2 trials, which are also often conducted still in the academic setting, whereas when it comes to later phase clinical trials, then this cannot be handled anymore by universities. That's then really taken up by pharma companies to bring such products on the market. When we look into our field and into new innovative radiopharmaceuticals, how they were used, many of the recent developments have been made outside the strict definition of what the European Union considers to be clinical trials, which is very clearly defined. And I will come back to that in a minute. If you particular talk about the earlier phases, earlier uses of, for example, lutetium-177 labeled somatostatin analogs and PSMA analogs. Many of them were used in countries which allowed their application outside the clinical trials in the way of what is sometimes called compassionate use, using compounding practices to prepare them, and other specific national procedures. So having said this, I come back to that. What is regulated more clearly, and that is the clinical trial legislation, which again on the European Union level you can find in the Udralex, in the so-called Volume 1, where you find the general text, and then you have also a Volume 10 where you find more guidelines related to clinical trials. What we have today, we are in a transition phase from what was the Clinical Trial Directive to the new Clinical Trial Regulation, number 536/2014, and that now changes the way how clinical trials are handled, in particular the application process, which was until now a national process. So if you did a clinical trial, you had to submit this trial to your national competent authority, even when you had a multinational trial. This trial would have needed approval in every member states of the European Union. Now, with this new regulation, they have introduced, and that's the main reason why it took so long from 2014 to this year, so almost 8 years, was that the introduction of a central portal for submitting clinical trials, the so-called CETIS or CETIS. That name we will probably hear more often in the next future. And the idea is to make a centralized application, electronic portal where you submit your application, which is then assessed with very strict timelines. And you don't anymore have this, at least regulatory distinction between an ethical committee and your drug authority. That was typically the two-way application that where we used to now have to submit everything to your competent authority, which evaluates a new drug in relation to the clinical trial, if it's in terms of ethical considerations, but also doing the pharmaceutical evaluation of it, looking into the data that you have provided in relation to quality, safety, and efficacy of your drug. And then you can wait for approval and then start your clinical trial. For this, for submitting that, you need to develop specific documentation, a lot of documentation, of course, in the clinical trial related to the conduct of the clinical trial. How am I doing that? That's mainly in the study protocol. How do I document the study, case report forms? How do I document the consent of the patient and document that the patient has been properly informed, the informed consent form, and a number of other standardized procedures and documentations. Also a so-called investigator's brochure that describes the institution and the physician that is conducting a clinical trial locally, with all the information this group and person needs related to the drug that is under investigation, the so-called investigational medicinal product. So that's its own science, where you typically also have experts at universities or engage an organization that is helping you through these documents that have to follow another G, the so-called GCP, in differentiation to GMP, what we had before, a good clinical practice. But we then also need to submit a detailed information on our radiopharmaceutical in a dedicated dossier, also called Investigational Medicinal Product Dossier. So when we develop products, and that is what we will hear later on during today's program, is that we undergo different steps in our development. From, of course, we need radionuclides. If we make radiopharmaceuticals, we need to make compounds out of that. We need chemistry. We then have to characterize those in many investigations, both in vitro and in vivo. We have to think of how to formulate, to apply it in an appropriate way. And then we can go into a clinical trial, and we need to generate data, and that is how also the regulators look at and how they are structured, that you have data that are related to the quality of your pharmaceutical, but otherwise you have also data that relate to the safety and the efficacy of your drug. So also in the regulatory authorities, you will find experts in quality, and you will find experts in safety. Maybe the safety also in this context would be the preclinical or non-clinical safety aspects, but which is a core issue when it comes to new pharmaceuticals, to ensure that they are safe. But of course, you also need to have some data to show that they do what you intend the drug to do, so being efficacious, and you have, for example, experts related to these preclinical safety considerations, or sometimes also called non-clinical safety. Efficacy is related to the pharmacology. So in this context, so you need to generate these data, and then you need to appropriately describe your, in our case, radiopharmaceutical in a standard way, actually a little bit structured in a way that our authorities are used to. So coming back to this CTD format that you also need then for the marketing authorization, we have a similar structure in that. I will not go in too much detail in relation to that, but the quality documentation, for example, looks into the, or it has to be structured into the quality of your drug substance. So what is your active ingredient, active pharmaceutical ingredient in your formulation? And then in the second part, looking into the formulation, the final drug product. So that's the differentiation an authority wants to see. And for relation to safety, and to some extent, but for early phase clinical trials, it's really the safety that is in the forefront. Data that you have to provide related to pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, toxicology. Guiding you through this process, there is, of course, especially for the quality part, we have a guideline from the European Medicines Agency with many pages of just headers, how you provide your specifications and quality documentation to guide you through that. The ENM for several years ago wrote down a dedicated guideline on how to do that. This guideline related to the chemical and pharmaceutical quality documentation. This is sometimes also referred to the CMC part of a drug dossier. Especially this wording is very much used in the US, and relates that to radiopharmaceuticals, and also independent on how you prepare radiopharmaceuticals without going too much into detail. Looking into, finally, before I cannot speak anymore, finally going into the data that you should, in the context of radiopharmaceuticals, look into related to safety and efficacy. There are, and this is this educational talk on only relation to a radiation safety document, which relates to the risks related to the use of ionizing radiation, and that we have, of course, with radiopharmaceuticals, and it's an important part of describing also a safety of a radiopharmaceuticals, to relate that to the radiation dose that comes out of it, and there is this categorization of risk depending on the dose, with some sub-categorization, but talking about low, moderate, and significant risks related to that, and depending on that, that's, for example, what our authorities and ethical committee at the moment still very much looks into, which in which risk class our radiopharmaceuticals falls into. But we are not only have to look into the radioactive side of our radiopharmaceutical when it comes to safety. We also have to look into the non-radioactive part. I kept that relatively short, but where it comes more in the issues of toxicology and what data to be provided. Here we had discussions with some authorities, among them the European Medicines Agency, because there is an ICH guideline which deals with all the requirements, what is called the non-clinical evaluation data that you have to provide for pharmaceuticals in general. And this is, they said they will now consider a particular considerations in relation to radiopharmaceuticals. Here, unfortunately, this concept paper is still in a draft status, but it has been reviewed by professional organizations and they have made comments. So we're just looking into approval of this guideline, which should, at least to a certain extent, ease our lives in that it allows a very risk-based approach on what you have to test before you can go into humans in relation to the toxicity of your non-radioactive element that you are applying to patients. So when we looked into new radioisotopes, radionuclides, but radiopharmaceuticals, we have a lot of Gs to look into. I mentioned that GMP is an important part to consider in starting from the radionuclide radiochemistry but then in particular the formulation steps. We have, in the context of a clinical trial, follow good clinical practices. And what I did not go into, but relates to the last slide I showed, is that we additionally have even a GLP, a good laboratory practice, which describes in some ways how we should analyze some data, for example, in relation to the biological characterization. So some toxicity assays, for example, have to follow GLP, making the lives of us not easier. So I'm running out of time, so I leave it for now. I tried to give an overview of the regulatory context where we are with radiopharmaceuticals, from the approval of drugs with the marketing authorization over the way of how we have to handle them, how their quality is defined, and how we are evaluating them in clinical trials. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer one or the other questions. Well, okay. One comment I got, was maybe an error of a translation from my German into bad English that I called sealed spheres, sealed sources. We have a terminology in our radiation safety regulations, where this is a translation from. On the other hand, sealed spheres, what is the meaning is that they are not considered to be medicinal products because they are considered not to exert, are not released in the biological system, but remain strictly bound to that. Does this answer the question that was coming? Okay. The second question was how to get marketing authorization for a precursor, for example, lutetium chloride. That's a good question. I think we have also some really experts on this in the audience, I guess. Here so that's again the special case of radiopharmaceuticals, where a normal pharmaceutical will always have to provide data related to quality, as I said, and safety and efficacy. And at least the authorities look into or have, if I did not authorize such precursors, I have to say. So it's to some extent speculative what I'm saying, but here the quality component, of course, is the main part that you have to address in your marketing authorization. The European authorities have accepted that there is no clinical information related to clinical trials required for receiving the marketing authorization. That was also mentioned in the chat. If you look into the comment from Thomas Arroyo, yeah. So that's I think I've formulated in a similar way. So another question was coming from the audience: if lutetium-177 solutions for radio labeling have marketing authorization now, what are the implications for using lutetium-177 for GMP production from a source that doesn't have marketing authorization? So I think that means what is in some ways the meaning of a marketing authorization if you then label a product that has no marketing authorization, or if you have that's a very good question, and to be honest, I never fully understood how a radionuclide precursor could receive marketing authorization, and stating in the marketing authorization that this radionuclide precursor has a marketing authorization in combination with a licensed product. That's the typical wording that is then stated in the marketing authorization and also in the indications of the marketed product. So in my view, of course, that always a marketing authorization should go together. The marketing authorization as such will give you a confirmation on the quality of the product. The part related to safety and efficacy, of course, is then not covered by anything related to the marketing authorization. Okay, then a very good question. And I have to say, I don't have answers to all the questions because partly also that is we have our work group on standardization and harmonization, and all these questions are very much in the core of what we are discussing also internally in the next days. So the question is where in the PRISMAP supply chain does the Gs become, where do the Gs become important? In the supply chain, yeah, we will discuss tomorrow. I mean, let's say the most simple way, of course, the G and here it's mostly the GMP. Well, there would be the GDP as well. The GMP, that the easiest or the most simple way would be that the radionuclide is produced. As I showed before, the irradiation on the target is not part of the considered part of the GMP. But then, let's say, when it starts to when the chemical isolation and these starts, there are at least typically these steps are then considered to be already in the GMP framework. So ideally, you have a radionuclide that already fulfills this. Most novel radionuclides will not be that far. So then you have you as a user have to ensure that that parts that are not covered under the GMP are to be how do I word that now? To be followed and within your own GMP framework. I mean, that's maybe not worded very nicely, but or in other words, you have to qualify such radionuclides for your GMP compliant process that you typically is expected to be followed. Then there is one last question. Do we need sterility for precursor like lutetium chloride? Well, I can refer to the Pharmacopoeia, where you can look into the which answers that a little bit. So, to be honest, I would need to look it up again. So, but there is a statement that such a precursor needs to be it needs to comply with the sterility according to the Pharmacopoeia when used without further purification steps involved in your process. Or in other words, if you have a chemical processing of let's say the lutetium that you are using, which ensures suitable workup of your process, then you may not need sterility testing of your radionuclide precursor. But of course, I mean, it gives you, as a user, you have, if it's tested for sterility and it's sterile, it makes life, of course, easier. But if you look at such processes of preparing radiopharmaceuticals, let's take an automated module. You anywhere with all the products, you start at some non-sterile process, and that, of course, can also be true for your radionuclide. But you have to ensure that with a number of measures that your product is that your final product is not impaired by the quality of your starting material. And of course, you have to ensure if it's not sterile, do you have other attributes that ensure that, for example, the bioburden is low when you use for a production of a sterile product. I hope this gave you some answers, some better than others maybe. But I think for the sake of time, we will make a 1-minute break and then continue with the final presentation and with that I stop sharing my screen.